Good to see everybody here. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Galen if he would direct our minds in a word of prayer.
Let us pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we are so thankful that we have the opportunity to come and worship you. We thank you, dear Heavenly Father, for the beautiful day that we have had. We thank you for all the many, many blessings that thou hast given us. We pray for all of those who are ill and under doctor's care. Give the doctors the knowledge to tell them what will help them to be better. Be with our great country that we live in. Help our government to always try and follow your rules. Now be with us as we go through this service. And may we have our ears open and our hearts ready to accept the word of God. We pray all this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Last week, we finished up chapter 4 of Proverbs. We had actually started about verse 5 and went all the way through to the end of the chapter, verse 27. One of the key highlights I just want to kind of go over and review a little bit was in verse 7, where Solomon writes, "Wisdom is the principal thing." And what we talked about there is there's a lot of things in this life that we need to know. That's a given. We can't learn everything, so one of the important things we must do is prioritize those things that we need to do. And gaining wisdom, gaining knowledge, gaining understanding, gaining insight, and especially discipline is one of those things that we must do. Must be prioritized higher in our list. We must have that understanding heart that we may apply the knowledge to the problems of life as we go through life. I made a comment about a quote that I saw. It says, "Wisdom sees, but understanding feels." And I like that. I like that. It has a little personal touch to it. Then in verses 10 through 17, we really talked about there's two ways of life. Verses 10 through 13 talks about the wide ways of life, and that we find in Matthew, the 7th chapter, verse 13 and 14, where it talks about those two ways. And that narrow is the way that leads to eternal life. And that is the way of wisdom. The way of wisdom is the narrow way. And then in verses 18 and 19, 19 and 20, it really compared the two ways of life. The Lord by wisdom, wrong chapter. But the path of the just is like the shining sun, that shines ever brighter into the perfect day. The way of the wicked is like darkness. We compared light being righteous and darkness being evil. And then we kind of finished up with, I thought, a really good discussion about how society is falling apart with regards to the way we police ourselves with our language. Talked about some of the things I hear at school all the time. And that this comes from maybe a wide variety of things, from parents, from other adults, from other kids. And we had a lot of discussion on that. A lot of it is the way that we're taught, the way we're instructed. And I want to share with you a story today, in fact, that just kind of made me feel good. I substitute taught today at a place that I've never been to before. It was Earl Williams Middle School in Tracy. The pickings were slim, and I hadn't ever been there, so I didn't know what to expect. It was for a 7th grade science class. And so I got there, and the teacher had everything laid out. And in her notes, she said that absolutely no cell phones are allowed in middle school. She said if a student says he has to call his parents, you send them to the office, and they call from there. They are not allowed to take a cell phone out. I want to tell you, I spent all day there, 5 periods. I did not see one cell phone on that campus. Amazed me. I was stunned. It is for a public school. Truly is. But when you enforce the rules, and kids know that there's consequences if they break those rules, they're more apt to follow the rules. And I have to be honest with you also is that I didn't hear a lot of foul language. fact, I don't think I heard any bad words, which again could have blown me over with a feather. It was refreshing. I told the secretary as I checked out, I had a wonderful day. So I'll be happy to come back anytime. So, it is important that we instruct our kids, especially, in the ways that they should know and do what's right. Any questions on the review process or what we talked about? Yes, Jason. Oh, I said that the quote that I made was, wisdom sees, but understanding feels. No, and you're absolutely right. I was kind of more or less pointing to the fact that if you have empathy a little bit, you have insight, or you have an understanding, that wisdom that you need to give instruction and direction and discipline to that individual, whoever it may be, that might help you do it in a way that will be more meaningful to that individual. That's kind of where I was going with it. But you have to be careful of your emotions. A lot of people wear emotions on their sleeves, so to speak. Yeah. Any other questions or not? Okay, let's begin in chapter 5. Chapter 5 of Proverbs really could be categorized as instruction on marriage. It deals with two main subjects, the subject of adultery and then to be faithful to your spouse. The commentator Robert Jameson's short summary of this chapter spells it out pretty plainly. He says, here is a warning against the seductive arts of wicked women, enforced by considering the blessings and the advantages of chastity and the miserable end of the wicked. I like what, if someone would read verse 1 and 2 for me, please. I like how the NIV says. It says, my son, pay attention to my wisdom. Listen well to my words of insight. And I think that that's an important word to understand. I think Solomon here is speaking from some experience, obviously. This Solomon plea for strict attention indicates the importance of the severe warning against adultery that is about to be given, a subject that was briefly mentioned back in chapter 2 when we studied it, verses 15 to 19, and one that we will discuss again in Proverbs chapter 6 and 7 when we get there. So we'll cover it more than probably once. The emphasis given this subject in Proverbs is significant. If a young man would take to heart the warnings and prohibitions in Proverbs and those qualities mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, he would be a perfect man. And I don't mean perfect in the way of sinless, but perfect in the way of whole and complete. Does that make sense? Okay? I like how Solomon says again, and we saw this before back in chapter 4, pay attention to my wisdom. It's almost like he's saying the son is starting to drift a little bit, and he's getting him back on track. That's how important it is for him to listen and to pay attention, to lend your ear to my understanding. We'll see as we go through this study of Proverbs, the sins of the flesh, gluttony, wine-bibbing, and fornication are presented in graphic detail with clear and specific warnings against them. There is a possibility that I mentioned a little earlier that Solomon, the author of these warnings, gave them such an overwhelming emphasis because they were the very sins that ruined him in the end. Okay? Someone please read verses 3 through 6 for me. Now, your translation may say the lips of a strange woman, an immoral woman, or adulteress. This is any woman, what we're speaking about, who is not thine own, okay? It mentions here in verse 3, for the lips of an immoral or strange woman drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than the oil. Her words here are flattering. Her suggestions sound reasonable, and what she is offering appears desirable. But such indulgence leads to remorse and death. Because you see in verse 4 it says, but in the end, yes, indeed, there is an end that follows sinful sexual gratification. And Proverbs does not let you forget it. It says she is bitter as wormwood. Anybody know what wormwood is? Say that 10 times in a row real fast. And I have to be honest with you, I had to look it up, so I'm not. Well, that's what I initially thought. But what wormwood is, it comes from a shrub that is of very bitter taste. It's used in the making of medicine for deworming animals and human beings, roundworms, pinworms, those type of things, parasites. It's also used as an insecticide. It has a very, very bitter taste. Now notice the gamut here we run. At first he talks about the woman, an immoral woman, her lips drip honey. We all know how sweet and good tasting honey is, and then we go to the far extreme of how bitter wormwood is. He wants to explain that as best he can to make sure you understand how low and how bad it gets. And so from there we see in verse 5 and 6, and we've seen these phrases before. We've read about them in chapter 2. Sinful sexual relations literally bring death to mankind, both a spiritual death and can be a physical death when you think about all the different diseases that exist out there. AIDS, things like that. Back in the days before they had antibiotics, people died of syphilis, other venereal diseases. So yes, death was certainly a possibility. Verse 6. I like the NIV translation. It says, she gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths are crooked, but she knows it not. What does that mean to you? She gives no thought to her way of life. She don't care. Nah, she don't care. That's exactly why. Right. Her paths are crooked and she just doesn't care. I think that's absolutely right on. Any other discussion on that first 6 verses there? Right. And it's interesting, I mean, the word used, sharper than any two-edged sword. We know that a two-edged sword can cut coming down or can cut coming up. And it is more deadly than a single blade or single-edged sword. So yeah, and that's a good comparison. Any other thoughts? James? Yeah. Yeah. No, good. Good point. Okay. Verses 7 through 8. Someone please, if you don't mind, read that for me, please. Yeah, the warning here is absolutely to avoid her at all cost. There are some temptations that must be avoided in order to successfully be resisted. And fornication, adultery, related vices are in that category. The New Testament echoes the same admonition. Flee youthful lust, Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 2 and 22. At all costs, you must avoid her. Verses 9 through 14, I'll read it. Lest you give your honor to others and your years to the cruel one, lest aliens be filled with your wealth and your labors go to the house of the foreigner, and you mourn at last when your flesh and your body are consumed, and say, how I have hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof. I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the congregation and the assembly. Verses 9 through 14 is a warning of what befalls or what's going to happen to violators of this law. The evil results of relations with a strange woman fall into three divisions. Loss of wealth and position, verses 9 and 10. Physical deterioration of the body, verse 11. And then we know, and we're going to talk about, there's certain legal penalties when you take part of things of this nature. And we'll discuss that here in a minute. Such activities as prostitution, adultery, don't they bring poverty in the long run? Think about it. Think about it. TV shows that you've seen that have shown prostitution. It's not glamorous a lot of times. It's not at all. And there are many ways which this is brought about. And then the physical deterioration. The physical destruction that is identified with this sin is epic in proportions. And we talked about it a little bit earlier briefly. Look at all the different diseases that one could get by this kind of behavior. Galen. Yeah, 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 and it's sad. Mary? Okay. Picked upon? Yeah. Yeah. We're actually, as we get a little bit further into this, we're going to see that it's as much of the man's fault, if not more, than the woman's fault. Okay? Well, huh? Yeah. But we'll get to that. But that brings up a good point. We're blaming the woman all the time, and the man is just as much to blame, if not more. But remember, Adam didn't stop her. I mean, where was he? What's that? That's exactly right. He was as much guilty as Eve was. Yeah, they tried to blame the woman. What's that? Leadership, yeah, as the head of the household. Yes, Jason? Personal experiences? Right. Absolutely, get away from it. Don't go near it. Yeah. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, and it's not like Solomon did not have instruction on this. He just didn't listen to his instruction. He didn't follow it. And that's what got him into trouble. And you're right. Sometimes you have to just to flee from it as quick as your feet will take you. Jim. Right. That's right. You're absolutely right. I mean, look, we all know that there's male prostitution going on, you know. We've heard and read about that. The last part there about the certain legal penalties. Look, people get arrested for soliciting. They got to post bail. They got to pay a fine. They got to have attorneys, etc., etc. It costs lots of money. So there's a financial aspect of this also, plus the legal side. I like what Burton Kaufman wrote here. He says, the thrust of the whole passage is that unlawful and promiscuous sex destroys the participant socially, financially, morally, and even physically. Such activity is a sin against society, against the family, against one's own body, against the church, and against God himself. Can't put it any better than that, I don't think. Any thoughts on that particular, where we're at, up to verse 12? Okay, look at verse 12. And this is what we talked about a little earlier. And say, how I have hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof. I have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to those who instructed me. Even more terrible than the results of this wickedness is the bitter remorse that tortures the violator in his later days. Here Solomon says that the violator admits that he was not without teachers and advisors, but what? That he gave no heed to their instruction. Who's that fall upon? Himself. That's his wrongdoing. Verse 14. I was on the verge of total ruin in the midst of the congregation and assembly. Physical, financial, and socially. We talked about that already. This vice is like a whirlpool, sweeps all others into its vortex. As the commentator De Hoff wrote, this vice leads one into all others. Every sin has a group of cousins who always come to visit. Isn't that true? Isn't that true? Any thoughts or more additional comments on those first 14 verses that we talked about? Okay. Moving on here to 15 through 23. Go ahead and stop right there. I'm sorry. I just wanted you to go through 19. 15 through 19. Thank you. Here the teacher passes to positive instructions on the sacred joy of a pure and happy marriage in the terminology that's similar to we see in the Song of Solomon. This is a call to cherish holy love in marriage, what we're talking about. Thine own cistern, thine own well, thy fountain. Find these in Proverbs 5 there in verses 15 and 18. All these metaphors are for one's wife. And the springs and the streams that we read about, it was just mentioned in Proverbs 5 verse 16, are metaphors for one's children. See, here's a part that we haven't talked about. The adulterer's children are dispersed abroad and found in the streets. He never knows how many children he might have. Very, very seldom will they ever find out. Promiscuous and unlawful sex relations throw doubt upon the paternity of children in this situation. It's a sad, sad situation. A lot of children born out of wedlock, out of things of this nature. You know, Burton Kaufman, I like him as a commentator. He wrote here about the verbiage and the words used. He says, the language here is frankly erotic, a rare emphasis in Scripture. But it is highly important to see sexual delight in marriage as a God-given blessing. And history confirms that when marriage is viewed merely as a business arrangement, not only is God's bounty misunderstood, but human passion seeks other outlets. The relationship that a husband and a wife have is blessed by God. And He's given us many things that we can enjoy in that relationship. I like how it says here in verse 19, as a loving deer and a graceful doe. Your translation may say hind, and that is another word for doe. It goes in to say here that here we have other figurative references to a loving wife. In the whole cycle of Arabian and Persian poetry, the antelope, deer, and the gazelle are chosen images of beauty. Acts 9:36 tells us of a Christian woman named Dorcas, which means gazelle. And Tabitha is the Aramaic version of the same name. I find that kind of interesting. Any comments on 15 through 19? You know, his use of words it has a distinct purpose. Okay? He's showing us the blessings and the joys that we should enjoy and be happy with in our relationship with a husband and wife. Jim. Absolutely. Good comment. Anything else? All right, let's finish up. If someone would please read 20 through 23. Go ahead and go through 23. Okay, that word there in verse 20 where it says enraptured, who has another word for that? Intoxicated, yes. That's a synonym for that word. Yes, in verse, it's also in verse 19, where it says, and always be enraptured or intoxicated with her love. Then it says, for why should you, my son, be enraptured or intoxicated? Or the NIV says, I think, captivated. Exhilarated is the New American Standard. Yeah. Ravished, absolutely ravished. In fact, ravished, be ravished always with her love. Commentator Tate identified this word ravish as the key word in this chapter. That's how important it is. He defined it as infatuation, but intoxicated is also said to be, as we talked about, a synonym for that word. The ways of the man are before the eyes of Jehovah, Or my translation says, for the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all the thoughts. Here the teaching assumes a little higher tone. It brings the husband's conduct, Mary, into relations with the duty that he owes to God. Okay? We see here in verse 22, his own iniquities entrap the wicked man, and he is caught in the cords of his sin. It is important to note that these verses place the blame where it belongs, not particularly upon the woman, but upon the man whose wickedness has been spelled out here. As Jim said, it takes two to tango. Yes, Jason. Absolutely. There's one person you'll never be able to fool. Yeah, God always knows. And that's with any sin that we happen to commit. Yes, sir. Right. Yeah. I like the analogy of being a recipe. It's a recipe for disaster if you don't follow it. But it's a recipe for success if you do follow and do what God says. Wayne? No? Any other thoughts on that particular one? Jim? Mm-hmm. Middle of the road. That's right. No. You can't keep anything from God. He always knows. Good points. Any other comments on that one? Last verse here it says, he shall die for lack of instruction, and the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. I like, in this verse, the NIV really has a much preferred reading of it. It says, he shall die for lack of discipline. Okay? Instruction he had. We talked about that. Discipline he had not. And in that condition, his death was assured. It's not like he wasn't taught. He just didn't follow the teaching. And that says something to us today. We're taught the right way. We know the right way. You know, as I could tell kids at school, you're all at the age of accountability. You know right from wrong. You know, you may not know what every rule is and what line, but you know right from wrong. And you need to do what's right. Jim. No, no, no. Oh, yeah. Well, just as important as they were setting up Jesus, too, because absolutely. Yeah. Sure does. Jason and then Mary. You guys from Arkansas or something? I mean, yeah, there's a great price to pay, not only in this physical world we live in, but certainly when it comes to the day of judgment. Well, I am too. I don't know where his heart is now. I hope it's been made right. I don't know. Not for me to judge, I guess, but I can only hope that he's right. Our time is over. We got a little bit of time. I can start on chapter 6 if you want to, or we can call it quits for tonight. I have chapter 6 is going to be interesting. I'll just give you a little preview about don't be a co-signer on anybody's note. That gets you in trouble. Don't be a guaranteer. It's not, it's one thing to loan somebody some money or even give somebody some money to help them out of a bad situation. But if you sign or if you shake hands and say, I guarantee this debt will be covered no matter what, that's a scary process. I don't know if anybody's ever had any experience in that. I'll share with you one quick story, then we'll call it evening. When Patricia and I was down in Southern California and going to church in Norco, there was a Hispanic family whose the wife was from Mexico, but she was an American citizen. She went through the process. Their kids were born in the United States, but the husband was not. He was here illegally. And we tried to work with immigration lawyers and whatnot to get him to go through the process, and he was willing. But one of the things was that you had to have a sponsor. Okay? And this sponsor, the attorney told me as I sat there, said, you are responsible for anything that this man does. I said, excuse me? And he says, yeah. If he runs up a $250,000 medical bill because there's nothing that he did, just happened, and he can't pay, you're responsible for that if you're the sponsor. And I gotta be honest with you, I couldn't do it. I couldn't put myself in that position. And I felt bad, and I hope they understood, but you have to be real careful. Oh, Mary? Yeah. I would say when you say children, I think there's an age in there that you need to think about, and that can vary from person to person. I'm going to think, early teenagers maybe, or, along in there somewhere. I'm not sure kids in elementary, young kids would understand that. Yeah, teens certainly need to be taught that. Yes, sir. Yeah, well, and that's, yeah, very well could be. I have not studied that as far as what age they should be taught. Every one of them should be taught it. Yeah, yeah, very young. Yep. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you need to lead by example. You need to set the example, Jason. No. Yeah. Yeah. Jim. Yeah. Couldn't agree with you more. Our time is up. I can't believe I made it through a whole chapter tonight. We'll start on chapter 6 next week. Thank you very much for your kind attention and your